You can hear fear long before the first missile appears, because in the world of sea power, fear often arrives as absence. It arrives as a radio channel that goes quiet, as a shipping lane that suddenly looks too empty, as a convoy that was promised but never forms on the horizon. That was the image at the center of this crisis, the world's most important energy choke point under threat. American warships moving into position, oil markets trembling, and yet many of Washington's closest allies still choosing distance over entry. The title sounded like a warning and a mystery at the same time. The Convoys That Never Came. Why U.S. allies refused to enter the Strait of Hormuz war. To understand why those convoys never came, you have to begin with the strait itself, that thin gateway between the Persian Gulf and the open sea. Around 1/5 of the world's oil and petroleum liquids moved through the Strait of Hormuz in 2024 and early 2025, making it one of the most strategically important maritime passages on Earth. When that artery tightens, the whole world feels it. Tanker schedules change, insurance rates rise, traders stop speaking in predictions and start speaking in panic. Governments that seem powerful in public begin to study maps in private and ask the oldest question in strategy: what happens if this road closes? By mid-March 2026, Reuters reported that Iran had effectively blocked almost all maritime traffic through the strait, forcing Gulf producers to rush oil through alternate pipelines and pushing the crisis far beyond the battlefield itself. In that atmosphere, every nation that depended on Gulf energy suddenly had a decision to make. Would they stand beside the United States in a dangerous effort to reopen the passage, or would they step back and let someone else absorb the first shock? This is where the story becomes larger than warships and headlines. It becomes a story about fear, survival, calculation, and the limits of alliance in a moment when the Iran and Israel war started touching the machinery of the global economy. On paper, the answer seemed obvious. The United States has allies across Europe and Asia. Many rely on open sea lanes. Many have worked with Washington for decades in wars, patrols, sanctions, and joint operations. In the old imagination of Western power, this was the moment when partners would rally automatically, when flags would line up beside the American fleet, and when the language of unity would become steel in the water. But real crises are not written on paper. They are written in risk. And the closer the risk came, the more the alliance picture began to fracture. Reuters reported on March 16 that several major U.S. allies, including Germany, Spain, and Italy, rejected requests to support military operations in the Strait of Hormuz, while others kept their words cautious and their commitments vague. The refusal was not loud, but it was historic. It said something most people do not want to hear when the danger becomes immediate. Even strong alliances begin to reveal their private doubts. Those doubts were not only military. They were political, legal, economic, and emotional. European governments feared being pulled into a wider conflict they had not shaped and did not control. Spain went as far as ruling out participation in any military mission in the strait and argued that the priority should be ending the war, not widening it. NATO countries also showed reluctance, and Reuters reported that President Trump publicly complained that allies did not want to get involved in the Iran operation, even as he pressed them to help police the strait. Behind those diplomatic phrases was a colder truth. Every government understood that sending naval forces into Hormuz during active hostilities would not be a symbolic show of support. It would be an act of entry into a live battlefield where drones, missiles, and maritime attacks could turn a protection mission into disaster within minutes. Even the question of mines was wrapped in uncertainty, with Reuters reporting days earlier that the Pentagon said there was no clear evidence Iran had actually mined the strait, despite reports and fear that it might. That uncertainty made everything worse. A confirmed threat can sometimes be managed, but an uncertain threat expands in the mind. One captain imagines a minefield. Another fears anti-ship missiles from the coast. Politicians in distant capitals imagine burning hulls, captured sailors, and a public suddenly asking why their country entered a war it never chose. Nations rarely say we are afraid. Instead, they speak of proportionality, legality, escalation, and consultation. But beneath those careful words, fear still moves the pen. And while allied capitals hesitated, the pressure kept rising. Reuters reported that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were scrambling to bypass the strait through pipelines, a sign that even the region's strongest energy exporters were acting as if the maritime route could not be trusted in the near term. When states begin searching for alternate roads, they are admitting that the main road is no longer safe. And when allies watch all of this and still decline to sail in formation, they are revealing that the cost of joining may be greater than the cost of standing back. So the sea waited. The markets watched. The ships that many expected never came. And as the strait narrowed from a waterway into a test of will, the most powerful question was no longer whether the world needed convoys. The question was who would dare to be first. What made the silence even more unsettling was that it did not happen in a vacuum. This was not a world at peace suddenly interrupted by one dangerous week. This was a world already exhausted by escalation, already haunted by images of retaliation, burning infrastructure, emergency summits, and military statements written in the language of necessity. The United States and Israel had already pushed the conflict into a far more dangerous phase, and by the time global attention fixed fully on the Strait of Hormuz, the wider crisis had become a test not only of military strength, but of political courage and strategic restraint. Every government understood the stakes. Around 20% of global oil and natural gas trade depends on this narrow maritime passage, and by March 17, 2026, Reuters reported that Iran had effectively blocked almost all maritime traffic there, forcing Gulf producers to rush exports through alternate pipelines. That meant the danger was no longer theoretical. It was measurable. It was moving through tanker schedules, insurance premiums, market fears, and national energy plans. But still, the Allied fleets did not rush in. And that was the moment when the crisis stopped looking like a simple military problem and started looking like something darker, a fracture inside the architecture of Western power itself. Because alliances are often misunderstood by the public. People imagine them as iron chains, fixed and unbreakable, as if one nation can simply call and all the others must move. But alliances do not work like machines, they work like nervous systems. They respond to pressure, memory, law, domestic fear, and political trust. And in March 2026, too many of those signals were flashing red. European governments had not been eager to be associated with the military direction of the war. NATO itself stressed that it is a defensive alliance and had not been consulted before the conflict expanded. France publicly ruled out taking part in operations to unblock Hormuz while hostilities continued. Spain refused participation. Germany kept its distance. The European Union showed no appetite to stretch its naval mission into another war zone. These were not minor diplomatic hesitations. These were warning signs. They revealed that many allies feared not only the Iranian threat in the water, but the American demand behind it. They feared being drawn into an operation that might begin as escort duty and end in open war at sea. And once that fear enters the calculation, everything changes. A convoy sounds simple from a podium. It sounds like order, like strength, like ships sailing together against chaos. But inside military planning rooms, a convoy in wartime is something else entirely. It is a chain of vulnerable targets moving through a narrow space that can be watched from shore, tracked from air, threatened by missiles, drones, mines, small boats, submarines, and human error. It is one thing to escort commercial traffic through a tense but functioning corridor. It is another to do it when the corridor itself has become part of the battlefield. One explosion beneath a tanker, one missile strike on an escort ship, one panicked response in the wrong direction, one burning vessel drifting across a shipping lane. That is all it takes for a protection mission to become a global crisis live on every screen. This was the hidden terror beneath the public debate. Leaders were not just deciding whether to help the United States. They were deciding whether to accept the possibility that their own sailors might become the first dead of a war their publics did not understand and their parliaments had not approved. That was why even nations with strong reasons to care about Hormuz still hesitated. Japan was one of the clearest examples. Its energy dependence should have made it one of the strongest supporters of a mission to secure shipping. And yet Reuters reported on March 18 that Washington's push to get Japanese warships involved ran directly into Tokyo's constitutional and legal limits. Japan's post-war system does not make it easy to enter a state-on-state conflict far from home, especially when the legal basis of the wider war itself is under debate. This matters because it destroys the illusion that strategic interest automatically becomes military participation. It does not. Sometimes the more a nation depends on stability, the less willing it becomes to gamble that stability on an uncertain operation. Sometimes caution is not weakness. Sometimes it is the last form of control a state still possesses. And then came the suspenseful center of the crisis, the moment when every side realized that the next step might define the war's future. The sea was no longer simply closed. It was waiting. American pressure on allies was rising. Iranian leverage was rising with it. Oil producers were racing to bypass the strait. Prices were moving. Insurance fear was spreading. Intelligence warnings multiplied. But the coalition Washington wanted still did not fully materialize. The emptiness became ominous. Because if the Allies refused, the United States would have to decide whether to move deeper with a thinner coalition, perhaps even largely alone. And that is one of the most dangerous moments in any conflict, when a superpower discovers that the logic of its military position is no longer matched by the logic of its alliance system. At that point, every move becomes heavier, every order carries more risk, every destroyed radar site, every strike near the coast, every escort pattern on a maritime chart starts to feel like the opening line of a much larger catastrophe. The Iran and Israel war had already shaken the region, But in Hormuz, it threatened to transform itself into something even more consequential, a conflict that could expose how reluctant the wider world had become to march in formation behind American force. That is why the missing convoys mattered so much. They were not just missing ships. They were missing consent, missing confidence, missing trust. They revealed that many U.S. allies no longer saw automatic military participation as the price of partnership. They wanted de-escalation where Washington wanted momentum. They wanted distance where Washington wanted alignment. They wanted legal clarity where Washington offered urgency. And perhaps most of all, they wanted to avoid being trapped inside a war that was expanding faster than diplomacy could contain it. The sea does not care about political language. It only reflects outcomes. And the outcome, at least in that moment, was unmistakable. The most powerful naval alliance network in the world had been tested at one of the most dangerous chokepoints on Earth, and instead of a wall of steel, what appeared first was hesitation. Not surrender, not collapse, but hesitation powerful enough to alter the shape of the crisis itself. That was the real turning point. Because once the world saw that the convoys were still not coming, another question began to rise from beneath the waves, colder and more frightening than the first. If America's allies would not enter the Strait of Hormuz war, then who, in the end, would be left to face the fire alone? And that is where this story stops being only about warships, alliances and oil, and starts becoming a lesson about power itself. Because real power is not measured only by the weapons a nation can deploy. It is measured by the number of others willing to stand beside it when the cost becomes real. In calm years, many countries speak the language of unity. They sign communiques, attend summits, repeat the vocabulary of shared values, and present a picture of strategic harmony. But history has always been less interested in promises than in moments of pressure. The Strait of Hormuz became one of those moments. It became the place where speeches met risk, where partnership met fear, and where the distance between formal alliance and actual commitment was exposed under the hardest light. The convoys that never came were not simply missing from the sea. They were missing from the myth. They showed that in the modern age, even the most powerful coalition on paper can hesitate when the battlefield becomes too narrow, too explosive, and too politically costly. For the United States, that was a warning. For its allies, it was a calculation. For the rest of the world, it was a revelation. Because the world had been watching this crisis with a mixture of dread and fascination. Traders watched it through the movement of prices. Generals watched it through surveillance feeds and maritime maps. Presidents and prime ministers watched it through intelligence briefings and domestic opinion polls. Ordinary people watched it through headlines that sounded distant until fuel prices, shipping costs, and market fear began to creep into daily life. That is the hidden force of a chokepoint like Hormuz. It takes something that feels far away and drags it into the bloodstream of the global economy. A narrow line of water becomes a pressure point for billions of lives. That is why the conflict mattered even to countries with no ships in the Gulf. It mattered because disruption there can travel faster than any fleet. It can move through supply chains, inflation, investor panic, factory costs, airline routes, household budgets, and national elections. The sea may look silent from above, but once it is threatened, the consequences begin speaking in every capital on Earth. That was the silent thunder behind the entire crisis. And that was why the absence of Allied convoys carried so much weight. It told the world that even when the economic stakes are immense, military participation is never automatic. Fear of disruption does not always create intervention. Sometimes it creates restraint. That restraint, however, comes with its own danger. Because whenever allies pull back from the front edge of a crisis, the burden on the lead power grows heavier. The United States now faced the prospect that reopening the strait, deterring further escalation, and protecting global commerce might fall disproportionately on its own shoulders. And that is the kind of burden that can distort judgment. A thinner coalition means fewer political buffers, fewer shared responsibilities, fewer symbols of legitimacy, and fewer voices carrying the moral weight of collective action. It can make every move look more unilateral, every strike more controversial, every casualty more isolating. This is how wars expand in ways leaders do not intend, not only through aggression, but through imbalance. One country steps farther because others step back. One navy sails deeper because the escort line is shorter than expected. One commander accepts more risk because the mission has already become too visible to fail. And suddenly the conflict is no longer only about securing navigation. It is about credibility, pride, endurance, and the fear of appearing unable to control events. That is the trap hidden inside many great power crises. Nations tell themselves they are acting to restore order, but slowly they begin acting to avoid humiliation. And once humiliation enters the equation, the path to de-escalation becomes much harder to find. This was especially true in a war environment already charged by emotion, ideology, and regional rivalry. The Iran and Israel war had already transformed the political temperature of the Middle East. It had fused military pressure with public outrage, strategic fear with symbolic revenge, and tactical operations with grand narratives about survival and dominance. In that atmosphere, every move around Hormuz carried meanings far beyond its immediate function. A convoy would not have been seen only as a security measure. It would have been read as alignment, commitment, and direct entry into a historic confrontation. A refusal would not have been seen only as caution. It would also be read as distance, doubt, and perhaps even quiet disapproval. That is what made the crisis so psychologically intense. Every government was sending signals, even when it claimed only to be managing risk. Every ship that stayed out sent a message. Every ambiguous statement sent a message. Every delayed decision sent a message. And beneath all of it lay the same central truth. No nation wanted to stumble into a war at sea without knowing how it would end. Yet there is another lesson here, one that is harder but more human. Fear is not always the enemy of wisdom. Sometimes fear is the final guardrail before catastrophe. In political culture, leaders are often praised for boldness, resolve, and the willingness to act. But history is full of disasters caused by men who mistook motion for strength. There are moments when refusing to rush forward is not weakness, but discipline. There are moments when hesitation is not proof of decay, but proof that the cost has been understood. Perhaps that was part of what the absent convoys really represented. Not merely disunity, but the recognition that once ships entered that corridor under those conditions, the world might cross a line that could not easily be uncrossed. A mined or threatened choke point, heavily armed coastlines, a superpower under pressure, regional actors driven by fear and rage, and a global economy tied to the outcome is not a setting for clean solutions. It is a setting for irreversible mistakes. The Allies knew that. They may not all have agreed on the politics, but they understood the danger, and so the image remains powerful because it is unfinished. The sea lane, the tension, the pressure from Washington, the calculations in Europe and Asia, the restless markets, the waiting tankers, the military planners with their maps and risk grids, the world held at the edge of a passage so narrow, yet so important, that it could shape the fate of economies and the future of alliances at the same time. In that suspended moment, the missing convoys became more than a military fact. They became a symbol of the age we are entering, an age in which power is still vast, but consensus is thinner, in which alliances still exist, but obedience is no longer assumed, in which the greatest dangers may not begin with the first shot, but with the realization that the partners you counted on are measuring the danger differently than you are. That is why this story matters. Because the Strait of Hormuz did not only test ships, it tested trust, it tested strategy, it tested the meaning of partnership in a world where even close allies now fear being pulled into wars they cannot define. And in the stillness left behind by the convoys that never came, the world was forced to confront a chilling possibility. Sometimes the most important turning point in a war is not the battle that begins, but the coalition that never arrives. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.